In 1994, a United States Supreme Court justice held up a court case. He used it to argue that the death penalty was just. He said the case was proof that capital punishment had its place in America. The two men at the center of that case were sitting in prison. They had no idea a Supreme Court justice had just used their lives as an example. They had no idea that the real killer had been living free this entire time, and they had no idea it would take 20 more years before anyone believed them. This is the story of Henry McCollum and Leon Brown. Two brothers, both intellectually disabled, both teenagers when police sat them down and didn't stop until they broke. Henry was 19. Leon was 15. Neither of them killed anybody. You need to understand where this story begins. Red Springs, North Carolina, 1983, a small town in Robeson County, population around 4,000. Robeson County sits in the southeastern corner of North Carolina. It has one of the highest poverty rates in the state. It has a long documented history of police corruption. In 1983, the county was racially divided: black residents, white residents, and a large Lumbee Native American population. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were black teenagers who had recently moved to Red Springs from New Jersey. They were half-brothers. They lived with family in town, and neither of them fit in easily. Henry had an IQ of 51. Leon had an IQ of 49. Both scores placed them firmly in the range of intellectual disability. They were the kind of teenagers who got overlooked, the kind who followed when others led, the kind who said yes when they should have said no. That detail matters. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. On September 24, 1983, an 11-year-old girl named Sabrina Buie left her home. Sabrina lived in Red Springs. She was supposed to come back. She did not. Within days of finding Sabrina's body, a local high school student walked into the police station. He gave them a name: Henry McCollum. That was all it took. No physical evidence, no witnesses to the crime, no forensic link. Just a name from a teenager who had heard something or said something or wanted something. Police picked Henry up. They sat him down. They started asking questions. Henry McCollum had an IQ of 51. He was 19 years old and intellectually disabled. He was alone in a room with law enforcement officers who had already decided he was guilty. The interrogation went on for hours. Let us talk about what a coerced confession actually looks like, because a lot of people hear the phrase and think it means police screamed or hit someone. Sometimes it does mean that, but most of the time it is quieter. It is a room with no windows. It is hours passing with no water, no food, no break. It is officers taking turns, one firm, one calm, one almost friendly. It is a person being told over and over that the evidence is there, that they know what happened, that things will go better if they cooperate, that they can go home if they just explain their side. For a person with a fully functioning adult mind, this is already hard to resist. For a 19-year-old with an IQ of 51 who has never been in a police interrogation room before, it is impossible. Henry McCollum did not understand that he had the right to stop the questioning. He did not understand that the words coming out of his mouth would be used to execute him. He understood one thing: the people in that room had power over him, and they were not going to stop. So he told them what they wanted. Henry signed a written confession. The confession described the murder of Sabrina Buie in detail. The problem was, Henry did not know those details. Police did. The confession was written in the language of law enforcement. not the language of a 19-year-old with a 51 IQ from New Jersey. Nobody noted that contradiction at the time. There is a concept in legal and psychological research called contaminated confessions. It means a confession that contains details fed to the suspect by investigators, not details the suspect volunteered. Details that came from the police themselves, embedded into the questions, suggested through leading language, offered as a way to confirm the story investigators already believed. When researchers later analyzed the confessions signed by Henry and Leon, they found exactly this. The language in those confessions was not the language of two teenagers from New Jersey. It was the language of law enforcement. The descriptions were clinical. The sequencing was precise in ways that matched the crime scene analysis done by investigators. A 19-year-old with a 51 IQ who was present at a murder does not describe it the way those confessions were written. An investigator who had studied the crime scene does. Then police went for Leon. Leon Brown was 15 years old. He was Henry's younger half-brother. His IQ was 49. He was even more vulnerable than Henry. Investigators interrogated Leon. He was a child. He was alone. He had no attorney present during questioning. He had no parent or guardian. He had no one to tell him he did not have to answer. Leon signed a confession too. He later said he had no idea what he was signing. He said he was terrified. He said he thought signing the paper would make the police leave him alone. He was 15. He was a child with an intellectual disability. He had just signed away his life. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown went to trial in 1984, 1 year after Sabrina Buie's murder. The state's case rested almost entirely on those two confessions. There was no physical evidence connecting either brother to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no biological material, no witnesses who saw them commit the murder. Nothing. Just two written statements from two intellectually disabled teenagers who had been interrogated without attorneys. The jury looked at those confessions and convicted them. Henry McCollum was sentenced to death. Leon Brown was sentenced to death. Leon was 16 years old when he received his death sentence. He became the youngest person on North Carolina's death row. Read that again. A 16-year-old child who did not kill anyone sat on death row. 31 years is not a number. It is mornings waking up in a 6x9 cell. It is meals through a slot in a door. It is watching the world outside become something completely unrecognizable through the small amount of news that filters in. Henry went in when Ronald Reagan was president. He came out in Barack Obama's second term. He went in when cell phones did not exist. He came out when every person on the street was staring at a screen in their hand. He went in as a teenager who had barely started adult life. He came out as a 50-year-old man who had never paid a bill, never rented an apartment, never held a job, never built a single piece of the infrastructure that ordinary life requires. Death row is not general population. Death row is isolation. It is 23 hours a day in a cell. It is limited human contact. It is living under a sentence that says, the state has decided you should die. Every morning on death row, Henry McCollum woke up with that knowledge. Every appeal that failed moved that sentence closer to reality. Every man he watched get taken to execution reminded him that the system was not broken. It was working, and it had decided he was next. In 1986, 3 years into his death sentence, Henry McCollum watched a fellow prisoner get taken to his execution. He watched the guards come. He watched the walk down the corridor. He understood what was happening. That same year, Henry McCollum attempted suicide. He had been on death row for 2 years. He was 22 years old. He was innocent, and he had already stopped believing he would ever get out alive. He survived. He spent 28 more years in that cell before anyone opened the door. Henry became North Carolina's longest-serving death row prisoner. He watched 42 men get taken to their executions. 42 men walked past his cell. 42 times he sat there and knew one of those men could have been him. 42 times he knew that no one outside those walls believed him. Henry McCollum denied his guilt 226 times over the course of his incarceration. 226 documented recantations. He told anyone who would listen. He wrote letters. He filed motions. He told lawyers, judges, investigators. He said the same thing every single time. I did not do this. I did not kill Sabrina Buie. That confession was not true. 226 times. Nobody moved. In 1994, the death penalty was under debate. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun made a statement. He said he could no longer support capital punishment. He wrote that the system was broken. He wrote that the risk of executing innocent people was too great. The court needed to respond. Justice Antonin Scalia wrote a reply. Scalia was one of the most influential Supreme Court justices of the 20th century. He was brilliant. He was sharp. He believed in the death penalty without reservation. In his reply to Blackmun, Scalia pointed to Henry McCollum's case specifically. He wrote that Henry McCollum was an example of why the death penalty existed. Scalia described the murder of Sabrina Buie. He described it in graphic terms. He asked how anyone could argue against executing a man convicted of that crime. He used Henry McCollum's case as his proof that capital punishment was just. Henry McCollum was sitting in prison when this happened. He did not know a Supreme Court justice had just used him as a justification for his own execution. He did not know he had become a legal argument. He did not know that in 20 years, the DNA evidence would expose everything. Scalia died in 2016. Henry McCollum was free. He had been free for 17 months. Scalia never publicly addressed what his 1994 opinion had meant for a man sitting on death row, who had now been used by the highest court in the land as a reason why he deserved to die there. In the 1990s, Henry and Leon won the right to a retrial. It felt like progress. It was not. Henry McCollum was again convicted of murder. He was again sentenced to death. Leon's situation shifted slightly. He was convicted of rape rather than murder. His sentence was reduced to life in prison. He was off death row, but he was still locked up for a crime he did not commit. And Henry was back on death row. Again. In 2004, something shifted. Henry McCollum's legal team filed a request. They asked for DNA testing on evidence from the Sabrina Buie crime scene. One piece of evidence stood out: a cigarette butt, found near Sabrina's body in that soybean field. Whoever committed that crime had been smoking. They left behind a cigarette butt. Police collected it in 1983. It sat in evidence for over 2 decades. In 2006, a nonprofit organization called the Center for Death Penalty Litigation pushed the court to test the DNA on that cigarette butt. The court agreed. The lab ran the test. The result came back. The DNA on the cigarette butt did not match Henry McCollum. It did not match Leon Brown. Neither brother had anything to do with that cigarette. You would think that ends the story there. You would think 2 innocent men go free in 2006. They did not. The DNA technology at that time could not match the profile to a specific alternative suspect. The lab could only say it was not Henry and Leon. They could not say whose it was. Prosecutors argued that was not enough. The test results were ruled insufficient to warrant releasing either man. Henry McCollum stayed on death row. Leon Brown stayed in prison. The cigarette butt sat in a file, and the real killer continued to live his life. You need to know about Roscoe Artis. In 1983, Roscoe Artis lived in Red Springs, North Carolina. He lived around the corner from the Buie family. He lived a short walk from the soybean field where Sabrina's body was found. He was a convicted criminal. In the weeks after Sabrina Buie was murdered, Roscoe Artis raped and murdered another young woman. Her name was Joanne Brockman. Same county, same method, same signature. Artis was arrested, tried, and convicted of murdering Joanne Brockman. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was already locked up when Henry and Leon went to trial in 1984. Here is what should have happened. A detective should have looked at Sabrina Buie's murder, then looked at Joanne Brockman's murder. Same county, same time frame, similar crime. A detective should have asked whether Roscoe Artis was involved in both. That question was apparently never seriously asked, or if it was, someone decided not to pursue it. Henry and Leon were already in custody. They had signed confessions. The case was closed. While in prison, investigators from the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission eventually interviewed Roscoe Artis. During those interviews, Artis offered specific details about Sabrina Buie's murder. Details that were not public. Details that pointed directly to him. The lead investigator from the Innocence Inquiry Commission later testified in court. He said Artis had repeatedly told them that Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were the wrong men. Artis knew. He had always known. He sat in a prison cell and let two innocent men rot on death row for 3 decades. When the Innocence Inquiry Commission ran the DNA from the cigarette butt, again with updated technology, the match came back clear. The DNA profile matched Roscoe Artis, not Henry McCollum, not Leon Brown. Roscoe Artis, the man who had murdered another woman in the same county just weeks later. The man who lived around the corner from the Buie family. The man who had been in prison this entire time. The man who had told investigators directly that Henry and Leon were innocent. On September 2nd, 2014, Superior Court Judge Douglas Sasser overturned the convictions of Henry McCollum and Leon Brown. Henry McCollum had been on death row for 30 years, 11 months, and 7 days. He was 50 years old. He had been 19 when they locked him up. Leon Brown had spent those same decades in prison. He was 46. He had been 15 when they locked him up. The judge ruled that the DNA evidence contradicted the case put forward by prosecutors. Prosecutors announced they would not retry either man. The charges were dismissed with prejudice. That means permanently. That means they cannot be charged for this crime again. Henry McCollum walked out of prison after 31 years on death row, after 226 documented declarations of innocence, after watching 42 men go to their executions. He walked out. There is footage of that moment. Henry McCollum steps outside the courthouse. He looks at the sky. He breathes. He had not stood outside as a free man since 1983. He was 50 years old and had never bought a cell phone, had never used the internet, had never seen the world that had been built while he sat on death row. He had gone in as a teenager. He came out as a middle-aged man with nothing. Leon Brown walked out too. Leon was 46 years old. The years in prison had taken something from him that did not come back. On June 4th, 2015, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory granted both men a full pardon of innocence. Not just a release, a pardon of innocence. That is the state saying directly, these men did not commit this crime. People assume exoneration is the end of the story. It is not. It is the beginning of a different kind of suffering. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown had no money. They had no job history. They had no resume. They had no housing. Henry had spent his entire adult life in a prison cell. He had to learn things at 50 years old that most people learn at 20. Leon had it worse. The years of wrongful imprisonment had destroyed his mental health. The trauma of being sentenced to death as a 16-year-old. The trauma of living in a system that told him he was a murderer for 3 decades. The trauma of watching freedom stay just out of reach. It broke something in Leon that did not repair. After his release, Leon required full-time care. He could not function independently. He had been taken from society as a child and returned as a man whose mind could not hold the weight of what had happened to him. Henry told reporters after his release that the first thing he wanted was a cheeseburger. Not revenge, not money, a cheeseburger. He had been thinking about it for years, apparently. The small things that people in prison think about. Normal food, a door that opens when you want it to, walking down a street without permission. These are things that people who have never been locked up never think about. They were the entire world to Henry McCollum for 31 years. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown filed a civil lawsuit against Robeson County. They filed against the law enforcement officers who interrogated them. They filed against the prosecutors who suppressed evidence. Their legal team argued that investigators had known about exculpatory evidence and buried it. Evidence that could have pointed to Roscoe Artis. Evidence that prosecutors had a legal obligation to hand over to the defense under Brady versus Maryland. They did not hand it over. That is not a paperwork error. That is a choice. In May 2021, a federal jury delivered a verdict. They awarded Henry McCollum $31 million in compensatory damages, $1 million for every year spent in prison. They awarded Leon Brown $31 million, $1 million for every year. On top of that, the jury awarded $13 million in punitive damages. The total came to $75 million. That number made history. It was the largest wrongful conviction award in North Carolina history. The same day, 2 individual defendants from the Robeson County Sheriff's Office settled separately for $9 million. The total compensation reached $84 million. Elliot Abrams, one of the attorneys for the brothers, said this after the verdict. The first jury to hear all of the evidence, including the wrongly suppressed evidence, found Henry and Leon to be innocent, found them to have been demonstrably and excruciatingly wronged, and has done what the law can do to make it right at this late date. At this late date. Henry was 57 in 2021. Leon was 53. $75 million is a number that sounds like justice. It is not. No dollar amount reconstructs 31 years. No dollar amount gives Henry back his 20s. No dollar amount gives Leon back his mental health. No dollar amount returns the versions of themselves that would have existed if the police had not put them in those rooms. Leon requires full-time care now. The money helps pay for that. But it did not cause the damage. The system did. This was not a tragic accident. This was a series of deliberate choices made by people in power. Police chose to interrogate 2 intellectually disabled teenagers without attorneys. Prosecutors chose to suppress evidence. The system chose the confession over the truth when there was no physical evidence at all. and nobody stopped it across 226 recantations, multiple retrials, and decades of motions. This case is not unique. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown are not an anomaly. They are an example. Studies show that false confessions play a role in roughly 25 to 30% of DNA exonerations. Intellectually disabled defendants are disproportionately represented in those numbers. When you sit someone with limited cognitive ability in a room with officers who are determined to get a result, you do not get truth. You get compliance. You get a signature on a piece of paper that will follow them for the rest of their life. This story has another dimension that gets lost. Sabrina Buie was a real child. She was 11 years old. She was murdered. Her family went through everything twice. First, they lost Sabrina. Then they watched two teenagers be convicted of killing her. For 31 years, they believed justice had been done. Then everything collapsed. When Henry and Leon were released in 2014, a family spokesperson said it felt like hell. They had to relive the murder. They had to face the fact that the real killer had been identified. They had to acknowledge that Roscoe Artis, a man living around the corner from their home, had murdered Sabrina and had let two innocent men carry the blame for 3 decades. Sabrina's family was wronged too. The system told them a lie. They spent 31 years believing it. Roscoe Artis died in prison in 2014, just months before Henry and Leon were exonerated. He had served decades for the murder of Joanne Brockman. He had given investigators details about Sabrina Buie's murder that matched the evidence. He had told them Henry and Leon were the wrong men. He died before he could be formally charged with Sabrina's murder. He died before Henry and Leon walked out. He died knowing what he had done, and knowing what had been done to two teenagers who had the misfortune of being in the wrong town at the wrong time, with a system that needed someone to blame. Roscoe Artis will never face a jury for what he did to Sabrina Buie. Nobody will. The case is officially closed. Henry McCollum was 19 years old when they put him in a room and broke him down. He was 50 when he walked out. 31 years. For a crime committed by a man who lived around the corner from the victim. A man whose DNA was on a cigarette butt at the scene. A man already in prison for a nearly identical murder. A man who told investigators they had the wrong people. Leon Brown was 15 years old when they did the same to him. He was 46 when he walked out. He needed full-time care by then. He did not get back what they took. Nobody does. A Supreme Court justice used Henry McCollum's case to argue that men like Henry should die. Scalia did not apologize. The officers who interrogated two disabled teenagers without attorneys were not criminally prosecuted. The prosecutors who suppressed evidence were not disbarred. The county paid $75 million in civil damages, with taxpayer money, not their own. Henry McCollum's case is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working exactly the way it was built to work for certain people in certain places. Two poor, black, intellectually disabled teenagers from out of town, in a county with a documented history of police misconduct. In a country where a confession, regardless of how it was obtained, is still the most powerful piece of evidence you can put in front of a jury. That is the machine, and it will keep running until the people inside it decide to make different choices. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown are alive. They have money now. They have their pardons. They have their names cleared. But they do not have their youth. They do not have their 30s, their 40s, the years when people build families and careers and something that feels like a life. Those years are gone, and nobody is going to prison for taking them. If this case matters to you, follow Untold Wrongs. Every case on this channel is a real person. Every case is a system that made choices. We are going to keep naming those choices. We are going to keep saying the names. Henry McCollum, Leon Brown, Sabrina Buie.